I became aware shortly after arriving at McGill that my optic, or my focus on Maasai, which I'd carried out for my doctoral work, was a little bit too narrow. That in effect they represented a form of a pastoral system, and there are numerous types of pastoral systems. But I became interested in trying to understand something of the whole and how a community of people interacts with territory, resources, neighboring people, and the state in carrying out basically a process, which is a process of pastoralism. Now, pastoralism is the use of arid or semi-arid lands, grazing lands, essentially, for supporting a human group. And if you think about many of the areas from Mongolia to West Africa, the Sahel, and East Africa, these are areas that are so dry that essentially they're only habitable by either hunting or pastoralism. Pastoralism is itself the management of domestic animals for the purposes of supporting a human group. And they use natural pasture for that reason. Improved pasture is costly and probably not really productive to make those sorts of investments if they could. So when we look at areas of the Horn of Africa or the edges of the Sahara or the great grasslands of Asia, we should always keep in mind that there are people there, it's occupied, because they have a set of technical strategies, which is how to use animals in certain ways such that the animals thrive and they reproduce, the herd grows, the herd can have animals extracted from it. Often a pastoral system is primarily a milk-producing system, and there's a fundamental error. People think that it's really about meat, but it's not. Of course, all the animals get eaten. As Evans-Pritchard pointed out, the destiny of all cows is the pot. But that doesn't mean that they are carrying out a meat production system. Basically, the day-by-day meal is milk, and it can be a combination of fresh milk, sour milk. So the sour milk, you can prepare it, keep it in a cool place in the shade, and you can consume it over a long period of time. Or butter. Butter, of course, is the extract of milk, which is, in that sense, I proposed, it has a certain sacred value or a certain ritual value because it represents this sort of distillation of the life of a cow, much as fat does when they slaughter a cow. So you have this source of food which can be used directly, or animals can be sold and other types of produce purchased on the market. In East Africa, you have people who come the closest to a pure pastoralist or specialized pastoral life, that is to say, living primarily off the produce of animals. While in the Middle East and many other areas, they essentially are much more integrated into the market, so that they're selling animals, getting money, and then purchasing the goods that they need, whether grains or vegetables or whatever. This has become less the case, and now I would say most East African pastoral communities are integrated into the market. So how do they work? Pastoral systems work. I began to interact closely with Professor Philip Saltzman at McGill, who had worked among the Baluchistan pastoralists of Iran, and he was involved in creating the Commission on Nomadic Peoples. And that's part of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. And what this did was bring me into contact with people concerned with pastoralism, far out of the purview of East Africa, people working in the Middle East, people working in Central Asia, people working in West Africa, brought together through the Commission on Nomadic Peoples. And in fact, this still operates, and last May I was at a meeting in Croatia, and there we had people from all those different areas. So this has opened up intellectual horizons and really stimulated us to think about similarities and differences across in a global context, but also to look at processes of change. So coming out of this experience, we published a number of books, collections of essays people presented, and those essays and those books began to really affect the field, and I'm quite proud to have been involved in this work. One was The Future of Pastoral Peoples that was published. It was a conference we had in Nairobi in 1980, and it was published by IDRC. Another was The World of Pastoralism. This is I put together with a co-editor, a geographer, herding systems and comparative perspectives. And there were a number of others that were concerned with change and development in nomadic and pastoral societies. So this broadened my own horizon to a comparative perspective on herding systems or pastoral systems. But it also made me, of course, look at my own area of East Africa in a slightly different way. How is it that the political system, and I've just described something of the role of the age-set system among the Maasai. How does this begin to affect the way they hold territory, defend territory, use territory? And it does. Basically, a pastoral section is a territory holding group, and they hold territory. They have a pretty rough idea about boundaries, where their area is. Doesn't mean that they're going to push somebody out who just comes in a bit, but if they come in a lot or begin to stay, then you'll have a conflict. And the conflict will be perpetrated by usually the elders who are tied to the age group of the warriors. So it's not just the warriors acting, it's a structure of alternations where age sets essentially are bound together in alternations. So they're like this. And at a particular time, you have the elder group and the warrior group, and they are, in effect, the ones who are in charge. These as governors, these as implementers. And so the holding of territory depends on the age set system as it is organized in a particular locality. And invariably, they are using the land in a way that alternates between wet season, dry season. In East Africa, you have a bimodal rainfall pattern. So in April, May, you have the long rains, and then in November, December, you have the short rains. And this affects the pastoral system in that they have an oscillation between wet season areas, which are areas that very often are only able to be used when there is standing water. So there's a whole ecology to the system. When the rain is there, they move out of their core areas because they want to let the grass rejuvenate there, and they go out where there's an area that can only be used when there is standing water. And then they gradually come back in the dry season. And if you think about why is it that in Eastern Africa they were able to basically experience and to organize a very highly productive pastoral system, such that they could almost entirely live on their own. Part of it is the answer of the reproductive cycle of animals given 2 rainfall seasons a year. And that's how they differ from West Africa, where you have a single rainfall system, and they basically oscillate to the Sahara, the edge of the Sahara, the Sahel, and then further south, and they go back and forth once a year. But there's an ecology to being able to have enough milk through the year. And that's because you have the reproductive cycles of cows, goats, sheep, and to some extent camels, and trained to that process. So any sensible territorial unit will try to capture within its bounds some areas that are relatively dry and will be used in the wet season, and some areas that are closer to permanent water, like a stream or a well system, that they can use in the dry season. And they'll try to also capture an area of swamps, which may come about because you have water that goes from a high area, like a mountain or an escarpment, goes underwater and then comes up. So there's a whole ecology of how the territorial units have been formed, but of course there's history as well. So having some grasp on that and thinking in that way, which I hadn't really done before when I was just focused on cultural systems, has made me aware of what it means to have a pastoral system, what the ingredients are, and what sort of changes are occurring that make the system evolve. And that's, more and more. There's an article I wrote on called The Indigenization of Pastoral Modernity. How is it that the systems are changing? And I looked at 4 pastoral systems, the Tswana, the Nuer, the Fulani, and the Maasai, and looked at basically the classic literature and how they use the land. And then I looked at the evolution or the dynamics of change that have occurred. Of course, the Nuer have been involved in the civil war in the Sudan, and that's profoundly affected their land use. The Fulani have been the agricultural people have come and occupied areas near the rivers, and so they're less able to move back and forth in a dynamic way. And among the Tswana, the capture of water sources have been by certain elites have constrained the pastoralism they can pursue. And among the Maasai, there are a number of dimensions, and let me enumerate a few of them. Population growth. We're not talking about systems, the same sort of territorial units, but the populations are triple what they used to be. So that has been important. Now, not all these people are sitting on the same land because they are educated and they're in towns and they're off to the capital city and they are businessmen and they are, in some cases, lawyers and doctors, but there are many who are right there. So the question is, how does a system manage under such conditions of population growth? A second would be the expansion of the market and monetization. So now they're involved in a system where whatever they do, they have to have an inflow of money. Why? Well, to pay medical fees. You can't say pretend like you're living in the middle of the 19th century where there's no clinics when you know there's a clinic right there, and you have a medical need that requires that. But getting there, the transport and the fees. Kids in school, it's now mandatory for all kids to go to school, but and school is free, and yet it's not free. You don't want your child to go off to school without a nice uniform that all the other kids have. You have to pay a fee for their lunches and their books, etc. The access to markets and towns have affected the way that land is held and used. And you have as well the dynamics of privatization of land that I'll talk about in another segment. So you have these different dynamics. So the pastoral system itself is severely affected. In some ways you could say it's good, because the markets, livestock markets are open, and one could suggest that an earlier period, for instance in Tanzania, when under the socialist period, you had the pastoral system was really constrained part of that is because the state wanted them to sell their animals at very, very low prices. So for the thriving of a rural economy, what is most important is that they have the ability to sell their produce on a market so they get a decent return, and they can basically participate as citizens in the wider economy. So pastoralists are undergoing various types of pressures. Some of them are what I've just described. There's also cultural change. We have to, and I think this affects Canadians as well. If we think, what does a child who grows up on a farm want to do? Some want to stay on the farm, and they want to take over from their parents. Many enjoy the farm, but they basically go to school and they want to move into other areas of life, and so they vacate the rural areas. What's very interesting, and I'll talk about in a few minutes, is people who want to basically leave the rural areas but don't want to give up their hold on the rural areas. So we have that sort of dynamic that's based on class formation in the rural areas. And certainly pastoral systems are profoundly affected by the genesis of those who are richer and those who are poorer. The questions of conflict are important. There are land rights conflicts, and I'll talk about those shortly, but in many pastoral areas, they are involved in conflicts that have to do primarily with land, resources, and livestock. And we can say, why would they fight over such things? Consider what the value of a cow is, and or a set of or a camel or something like that. In relation to cultivators, pastoralists own a tremendous amount of value in the form of livestock. And this livestock is mobile because you steal a cow and you get it going, and a couple of hours later you are far away. And so it's ready money to be had. And it's very, very tempting. I was interested to read at one point that there was a real market in Western Canada, because of course there the value of the really top grade cows is enormous. And people were coming up in the night with trucks, loading them on, and off they go. Well, that sounds pretty much like the rustling that the East African pastoralists have to put up with. So you have a type of wealth which is mobile. It can be sold quickly, or it can be inserted into your herd. And increasingly, people don't put them in their herd; they sell them, and so there's an international trade in this way. So the whole viability of the pastoral system is also articulated with the ability to defend themselves and to defend their livestock, which has appreciable value. Some areas of northern Kenya and elsewhere in Africa are areas that are fraught with conflict, and sometimes it's because you have age-old relationships where they sort of fight back and forth between two groups, but you also have what we might call the new forms of conflict, which is perpetrated by people who now have access to automatic weapons. If you could think about the spin-off of the civil war in the Sudan and in Somalia, and before in Ethiopia, the number of arms that are floating in the arms market that end up with certain people. Suddenly the costs of conflict costs have gone up because people can basically attack and kill people and take the livestock. So it's no longer largely symbolic as much. Anthropological work in the past has looked at the symbolic dimensions of conflict. The people in New Guinea who are essentially carrying out gestural threats, etc. Occasionally somebody gets injured, but it's basically they have proven courage by coming out. Well, Now it's, what does it mean to prove courage when the other side has an AK-47? So it's up the ante, and it's created circumstances that are quite difficult. I'm going to talk a little bit about conflict in a subsequent episode, so I won't say any more. So at any rate, my own interest in understanding pastoralists within a more global structure, within the state, in regions that they control, and what it means from the level of ecology, coming up to the control of land, subsistence, the economics of production, the use of markets or not, pushes towards seeing them in their actuality of today. If one wants to say, why should anyone continue to be a pastoralist? Pastoralism is an archaic mode of subsistence. I would say, how else will anybody live in an area that's very, very dry? Animal husbandry is what it's all about. You can go to areas of Alberta and you'll find people are basically living in areas living off of animal husbandry. Great production systems, commercial systems. Well, it could be that the pastoralists will be inexorably moving more and more towards commercial production. They'll be selling animals and getting money. That's already happening. And it's probably not a bad thing, because they're actually quite crucial in feeding the millions of people in these major cities of East Africa, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, Dar es Salaam, Arusha, etc. You can't have a build-up of population and not feed them, and people love meat. And essentially they're relying on this flow from the arid and semi-arid lands. So there will still be a need for land to be used for animal husbandry. The question of whether it will be a society that sustains itself, or whether it'll be simply a set of commercial ranchers, is probably a good question. We should all consider that the commercial ranchers of North America have been able to carry out their work at the expense of indigenous peoples. Essentially, clear the indigenous peoples off, and then you have lands that are available. So one has to consider, for places where you have a considerable pastoral population that is able to sustain them, and they're able to themselves be productive in a way that is at the service of the larger society. Why would one want to change that system to one which basically has sidelined indigenous peoples and at their expense, in order to give over land to a very few people? Because ranching is a system that uses land extensively with very little labor, if you think about it. Oh, a few cowboys. They've got helicopters, they've got trucks, they've got fences. Now, a pastoralist also uses land extensively, but uses labor intensively. So you have a family, and everybody in the family is involved in some ways. You have several families that are engaged in a homestead with collaborating in order to carry out the daily chores of grazing and watering and defending and trekking animals. It's a big job. But it's sustaining all those people. Why would one want to have a system which has fewer people and basically assumes people are going off to the city? Doesn't seem like a more positive area for me. So essentially, by looking at pastoral systems and seeing that the pastoral system as a mode of occupying and using territory in a way that sustains a human community, carries out a systematic operation, and also contributes increasingly to a larger market. That is pastoralism responding to the exigencies of the modern day. And when I talked about the indigenization of modernity, I meant to say pastoralists are not against modernization. They're being accused of being anti-modern. They're not at all. They love the modern world. They just want more of it. And to do that, they take their indigenous repertoire of orientations, ideas, strategies, and use it as a way of apprehending and appropriating aspects of the modern world. And so they're playing the game. They're playing it well, and it's really a bit of slander to suggest that they are anti-modern, or they are uninterested in the modern world, or they occupying land that could be used better. I'm not sure there are strategies for using that land any better.